Right now, I think most of us are thankful for the air conditioning. Since I work on Saturdays speaking to Navy federal members from all over the country. But so many different places seeing unique weather conditions. A lot of the Navy federal members I was assisting yesterday are people in California getting ready to face a hurricane for the first time in their lives. And I'm so out of local news, I didn't even know there was one coming to California. So the first people were telling me, hey, we need some money. We got to shore up here for this hurricane. So I'm over here on Google going, hurricanes, California. I said, they got a Cat 3 as of yesterday when I checked on it, headed for them. So that is a different experience for them. And of course, lots of places facing massive heat.
Cat 1 now.
It had gone down good.
It's Cat 1. The concern is still all the rain that's
Yes.
away in the desert environment. So.
All the ones I talked to personally yesterday were staying, but they were trying to buy supplies, and sandbags was number one on the list. So, yeah. So let us be thankful for all our blessings and try and be a little more mindful. Last week, if you got your hand out, then you see we've been going by that slide presentation there through the issue of how the early church worshiped, and of course what the Bible teaches about worship, what the early church did, what the church did in centuries afterwards, and we'll spend a little more time on that. This presentation this morning might be a little different. After I got feedback last week, I decided to go over this material instead of with that exact presentation, with one that on occasion I've been asked by elderships to come and speak on this very subject, because the church as a whole in the last two generations has grown very ignorant. And I mean that word in its honest context, if you will. Very ignorant on this issue of should we use musical instruments in the corporate worship? And is that a scriptural thing? Is that an opinion thing? So exactly where does that fall? So because of the settings in the audience in those examples, I don't use the handout we've been using. I use this one that I'm going to use this morning. So you'll see some repeats, and then you'll see some new stuff, and you may see them in a different order, but it's just all to help us better understand God's will on this issue and how we got where we are now. Some of you may remember I told you the story 2 or 3 years back about the older couple at worship one Sunday morning, and they are walking out after the service, and the elderly wife had already noticed a young married couple up in front of them and how close they sat together during the service. And so they walked out, and they happened to be walking out right behind them, and the young married couple was holding hands, and that brought a little smile to her face. And then the cars were pretty close to each other in the parking lot, so she was still observing them as they were going to their own car, and she saw how the young man went around and got the door for her and put her in and everything. So they got in, and they're pulling out onto the highway behind that couple in the car. And as soon as they get on the highway, she notices that the young woman slides over against the driver. And she sighs real deeply, and her husband over there behind the wheel looks at her and says, "What?" And she says, "I remember when we used to be like that." And he looked at her and he said, "Well, I haven't moved." One of the things I hope to firmly establish in your minds this morning, for your own sake, but more for those who you can educate on the subject, because again, not just in the church, but in the denominational world, extreme ignorance. See, the church's ignorance is great. Think about this. The denomination world is much greater on this subject. They have almost no teaching on this subject for the most part in the average one, if you will. So it says the instrument innovation. What's an innovation? It's a change. It usually has a connotation of being a good thing, but by definition, it's not good or bad. It's simply a change that is made. As an attempt at improvement. Keep that in mind. So some of these quotes are going to be from the earliest denominational leaders. Because fun fact, in this country, in our history, the instrument in all of the denominations is a new thing. They don't know where they started at. They're ignorant on this subject about where they started at. But even the scholars that these movements followed and based their personal brand of Christianity on are in direct violation to everything those founders of those denominations ever said or wrote on the subject of using a mechanical instrument, any mechanical instrument, in the worship service. So John Calvin, of course, who's the Presbyterian Church as a whole, the father of Calvinists, and etc., he said musical instruments in celebrating the praises of God would be no more suitable than the burning of incense, the lighting of lamps, and the restoration of the other shadows of the law. Never forget what the New Testament shows us so clearly, especially books like Hebrews, that the things in the Old Testament were types. They were teaching tools. They were shadows of the reality. So the church is the reality of the kingdom of God on earth. And those things with the temple, of course, all the furnitures, all the commands to the priest, etc., all the commands involving the sacrifices, all of those things were just shadows of what to come. So why do you think he would make a comment like that with those references to the burning of incense, the lighting of lamps?
They were getting away from the Catholic Church who do all those things.
Okay. Why did the Catholic Church start doing those things? Yeah.
They borrowed it from Judaism.
They took it from other religions and from the temple worship in the Old Testament.
Yep.
And they took elements that they thought were improvements, innovations to the worship service. When you take that attitude, and by the way, among most of the scholars I've dealt with, most of them, in denominational groups, they do know this history. They're scholars. And so they don't try and argue against that. They know it's a well-established, well-documented fact that their denomination didn't use them early on.
Sure.
So they will argue the argument from expediency, which we've already touched on. That rule was when there is a command without specific means of carrying out the command. So it is left to individual opinion, the elders of an individual congregation, etc., to decide how to fulfill that command. So I always use the gospel, for example. Are we going to have a radio ministry? Are we going to sponsor missionaries? How are we going to carry out the command to teach and baptize? So that is the argument you'll run into the most if you're dealing with scholars. But you're not going to be dealing with scholars for the most part. You're going to be somebody who attends one of these types of churches, and they're going to be blown away when you start telling them that they didn't even have that early on. So this is written because, of course, he is very aware that those who are starting to push to bring it in are using for their logic the fact that it was used in the Old Testament temple worship. There were, again, well-known facts, and it's in the scriptures, that there were instruments in the temple worship service. So he is taking other things out of the temple worship service and saying, hey, if your argument is right, then we should reinstall animal sacrifice, we should have the lighting of the lamps, we should burn incense, and all of these things that were also part of the Old Testament temple worship. So that is why that is his particular grace. And you see, this quote comes from his commentary on the book of Psalms. So, of course, the book of Psalms, the keynote for the Old Testament worship for what they were singing. And the early church sang a lot of the songs the same way, except without any instrument. So then there's one of my favorite scholars. I know I say that all the time, but he deserves his due. Adam Clarke, who has always been considered the best scholar that the Methodist Church ever had, and his commentaries are very popular in Christianity as a whole, but especially in the Methodist Church. But I'll say some more about that in a minute. But this is his comment on the subject. And he wrote this in 2 Chronicles because, as I mentioned last week in passing, he went so far with his denouncing of it that he believed David brought the instrument in on his own in the Old Testament worship, rather than, as most scholars feel, that David did that under the command of God. So he says, the whole spirit, soul, and genus of the Christian religion are against this, talking about the instruments in worship. These things have been introduced. Now, if you miss all the other slides this morning, get this one. These things have been introduced as a substitute for the life and power of religion. And where they prevail most, there is the least of the power of Christianity. Away with such pretentious baubles from the worship of that infinite Spirit, who requires him in spirit and in truth, for to no such worship are those instruments friendly. In other words, he's quoting a passage we like to quote a lot in John. They that worship God must worship him in spirit and in truth. And he is saying that bringing that instrument in is a violation of that, and that it takes away. How would the instrument take away from the worship? I mean, again, all we hear about is how, it's so much better with the instrument.
They're so loud you can't hear the voices.
Okay. They drown out the voices. It's a common complaint I get from when I talk to people in those.
What happens is, when you're going to worship, you're going there for a specific reason. The reason is supposed to be worshiping God and giving him the praise and the glory. But when you have instruments in there, you are going now for the entertainment that you receive from the instruments. Okay, so an entertainment value. Patty said that people stop singing. That has always been one of my main takeaways, is that when I see places that are big on the instrument, the people don't sing, they just listen. And I'll get back to that in a minute. Right.
I noticed that, like, the high schoolers were actually at the church and they all sat up front, and they were so involved in God's word. We love you, and I do too. You reach up, God. To me, it's just much that he's done and given us that we use it. But I've seen people just, it just, I don't know, it makes a huge difference. Especially when you're singing the Bible and with the words, but not only that, though, it's reaching up to God.
Yeah.
And asking him, to be here to save us. But I saw high school kids doing that, and they just loved it.
Yeah.
To me, I thought they probably wouldn't have been there, if it couldn't have been something that would connect them. And then we got them there, and then they were seeing God's words, and they were so involved in the.
And I will try and review some of my research during the coming week. But the psychology of how our brain works is very affected by music, and the instrument has its own effect on that. Twain?
I think it has so much to do with our ear. In other words, if you sit down to a meal, as an example, and you have a regular meal, and then you have a really nice, well-cooked, exactly to your taste buds, you know, oh, this is really good. This is, and so you recognize the difference. Anyone that's worshiped in a congregation, a very large congregation, with lots of great singers within that congregation, recognizes that when you hear that, you go, oh, this is nice. I like this. I like this. And we miss the point that God is not judging us on anything to do with what our ear likes.
Absolutely.
He is looking at our hearts. And so when people, we all encounter people, well, I just don't have a voice. I sound terrible when I sing. And I say, God is not judging you on that. God calls you to sing, even if it's just mouthing the words. He calls you to participate and encourage others by your participation and words. Nothing to do with music. And unfortunately, we've grown up in a society that I like great music. And when I listen to some hymns that I have on my phone, I'm like, ooh, that sounds so good. It's just right on. The tempo,
Right.
all the parts are there. Ooh, it sounds so good. But I missed the whole point of the worship service. And I think that's what it comes down to is my ear likes that.
Sure.
And then it's just as soon as I go for that ear and I like, then all doors are open then. Because the leaders recognize that. And they will provide more and more and more to satisfy that ear.
Yeah, and that goes back to Ed's comment as well. And a lot of these things that come up as we go through. One thing I did want to touch on that you mentioned just about the singing. And Clay, it's terrible that it's your first Sunday to lead singing. Clay's going to lead us in Chase. Sorry, he's going to lead us in singing today. What did you? Never mind. So Chase is going to lead us in singing today. I'm looking forward to that. I already put some pressure on him by requesting a song. But I grew up at Warrington in a time when the worship service was in the 200s. And we had a much greater number of good singers when we had, over twice as many people here. So the singing was pretty good. I mean, I have fond memories of the singing and everything. But I remember the first time I went to a Bible summer camp. And that was my first exposure to a large group, mainly young people, teenagers, singing a cappella all together. And I literally sat there in the middle of a field. It was at night. The sky was great. Of course, the camp's off in the woods, so you got a great view of the stars. And hearing that singing, and I thought for the first time, this must be what heaven is like. Yeah, I mean, I really did. I probably 12 years old at the time. I thought, this must be what heaven is like. Never had an experience like that. And that did really resonate with me. So we have to recognize that whether you're talking about bringing the instrument in, or you're just talking about the so-called quality of the singing, we have to recognize that a lot of times our ear is going to hear that. I don't have a great ear. But, I mean, sometimes I think I sing good. So I don't have a great ear. But it's always to be remembered that the purpose of a worship service is to worship God and not our senses. And that's what will still happen. So let's hold the rest for a couple of these, and we'll get some more of them as we go. Here, now this was what he wrote in 2 Chronicles. He's writing about that incident we touched on last week with David's moving of the ark. There's a much better representation in this presentation of that, but it's still very brief. This is his commentary on Amos, which is where there is a scripture speaking specifically about the worship service of the Old Testament and the generation that was living. I believe that David was not authorized by the Lord to introduce that multitude of instruments into the divine worship of which we read. I am satisfied that his conduct in this respect is most solemnly reprehended by the prophet. That is the passage I told you about last week. That depends a great deal on how you translate the words and then on how you punctuate that sentence as to whether you take it as a reprimand of David or not. And most people do not. But Adam Clark really didn't like what he saw as a minister happening to the church because the instrument was becoming popular in there. So the use of such instruments of music in the Christian church is without the sanction and is against the will of God, that they are subversive of the spirit of true devotion, and that they are sinful. I am an old man and an old minister, and I here declare that I never knew them productive of any good in the worship of God, and have reason to believe that they were productive of much evil. Music as a science I esteem and admire. Now, see, that part I identify with. I am so-called trained on piano for several years. I can read music. I just can't reproduce what I read. I love listening to these things. When I am alone in situations, I am either listening to scripture or listening to some of my favorite a cappella groups, because even on my own I prefer a cappella. So music as a science I esteem and admire, but the instrument of music in the house of God I abominate and abhor. You get the feeling that that's his strongest language in his vocabulary, don't you? I abominate and but think about what he says in that underlying portion. It's not a question even though I would question one that said it improves the quality of the singing. But it's not a question of whether it improves it or not. That's what we've been talking about. Even if it did improve it, and it could be scientifically established that it improved it, it would still be wrong. Why? Because it's against the will of God. When those scholars I mentioned earlier in these denominations argue for me, they argue out of allowance and expediency. So this is just a matter of expediency, and even if it's wrong, God surely doesn't care. I don't know how anyone, and a lot of them are really good Bible scholars. I don't know how anyone who is a good Bible scholar can come away and say God doesn't care about how we worship Him. From Genesis to Revelation, He makes it very, very clear that that is the most sacred thing, because that is coming into His presence. That is in His name, supposedly for His honor and His glory, and therefore He wants it done His way. What I always wind up with those Bible scholars is I always tell them, you know the history of music. And it was a music major, by the way, and a music scholar that told me this originally, because I did not know it before those days. But we touched on the early church and Gregorian chant and antiphonal singing last week. Remember where the leader says something, the congregation responds. 4-part harmony did not exist then. What I did not know was that the church literally created 4-part harmony. That is known as a basic fact to every music scholar in the world. That is the development of music. So when they study the development of music and they get the 4-part harmony, they're taught about how the early church, because it did not use any instruments, any mechanical instruments in the worship service, developed this mode of singing. So it was their way of staying within the commands of God to carry out the music command and change the singing to something that they desired, thought would be more pleasing to God. So they stayed within that field of opinion, see, but they carried out the command without violating any other. Monty, before I take you, let me say this. I'd rather wait, unless you think it's got to go right here.
I think it's a good spot.
Okay, go ahead.
Psalm 51 and verse 17 says, a broken
Heart and a contrite spirit.
Contrite heart, you will not despise. My sacrifices are a broken spirit. It's the way it starts out. It seems whenever I look at the Hebrew there, it says that the broken is like it's breaking into pieces. The contrite is crushed. And so it's what Wayne was getting to about a while ago, but it also fits in with what you were saying, is that God is more interested in the heart. Even in the Old Testament, you said that's an Old Testament verse. God was still concentrating more on the heart than He was a mechanical instrument or anything else. It was more of David's heart being done to it whenever he played a harp or whatever than it was anything. And so, but whenever we get that idea of breaking and crushing, if we break and crush our heart to what we want and surrender it to the will of God, that's what God is interested in. Break what you want and turn it over to God.
It's an excellent point. So that's Adam Clark, what do you say, best scholar in the Methodist Church, and recognizes that by the Methodist Church. His commentaries are what they tell their people to read. By the way, one caveat, I've mentioned this before, but I know there are a lot of people here that haven't heard me at least say this. If you get, Adam Clark's commentaries are very popular even today. I've got a set of them here and a set of them at home. If you get a set today, you are not getting what Adam Clark wrote. Because on two subjects, after Adam Clark died, the Methodist Church wanted to buy the rights to those commentaries. Because, like I said, they recognized him as their greatest scholar. So they went to the family of Adam Clark and said, we'll pay you to sign over the rights. And they did so, okay? Subsequent to that, then, when they began publishing his commentaries past that point of time, there are two subjects that they always edit out of his commentary. So when you read his commentary, if you're on those two subjects, and one of them, of course, is music. Anybody want to guess what the other is? Baptism. Yeah. So they take out those comments so that if you read him today, you don't know that he abominates and abhors, and things like that. But that being said, he was their greatest scholar. The actual founder of the Methodist Church is John Wesley. Right? What did he have to say when he was asked about people starting to want to bring the instrument in? The late John Wesley, who was a lover of music and an elegant poet, when asked his opinion of instruments of music being introduced into Presbyterian chapels, said this: I have no objection to instruments of music being introduced into our chapels, provided they are neither seen nor heard. Now, have a buddy who had an incident. If you're with one congregation very long, you have an incident probably once a year, really. And as time goes by, you got several, and then you usually get a parting of the ways because people can't seem to really move on from things. But he had been at a church for a long time, thankfully, when this occurred. One of his children got married the night before in the church building. And they had wanted a grand piano in there. And the elders had let them bring it in for that wedding. Well, being both the conductor of the service and the father of I don't remember now, I think it was his son, so he's probably the father of the groom. His other duties and festivities in general did not involve him in the cleanup. So, like many preachers, he's the first one to get there Sunday morning. He walks into that auditorium, and what's the first thing he sees? He sees that piano sitting there. They cleaned everything else up, but for whatever reason, somebody forgot to make sure the piano got taken out that night. And so there at the front of the auditorium was the piano. And of course, if you've ever watched anybody move a piano, you've watched several people struggle. Okay? I always say, it's not a two-man job, it's a four-man job, and they need to be four healthy men. But if you can't tell, I still have a piano. So he couldn't move it. He didn't have time to put anything together. So he literally got some tablecloths out of the kitchen and put a thing of flowers in the middle of it. But of course, most people knew what that was, but it was the best he could do under the situation. So, that's why I say I have been to a lot of places where the fight has been over just that. Okay, there's going to be a wedding. They want to have these instruments, and they want a piano or an organ, and you got to ask the eldership yay or nay on bringing it in. Why? Because it's not the worship service. So in theory, it can be brought in, but in wisdom, the debate always comes down to, is it wise to bring it in? And I have been with elderships that went all the way around the world. My favorite was the one that said, can't bring it in, but you can play tapes of it. Okay, what? Yeah. I failed to see the difference, really. But the main point of contention, when they vote no on bringing it in, is that they don't want anyone seeing it and walking away with the misunderstanding that the church does use instruments in its worship. So this issue comes up in a lot of ways, and not all of them are cut and dry. But the practice of the early church is cut and dried. And so that's what we have 5 more minutes to see. So Wesley doesn't want to see or hear them. Charles Spurgeon, one of the Baptist's greatest preachers and scholars, again in his commentary on Psalm, which is called The Treasury of David, what a degradation to supplant the intelligent song of an entire congregation with the theatrical prettiness of a quartet, the refined niceties of a choir. Listen to this language now. Of course, I always hate listening to these guys because you hear their vocabulary and you realize you're not very well educated compared to them. But the refined niceties of a choir are the blowing off of a wind from inanimate bellows and pipes. We might as well pray by machinery as praise by machinery. And if you've never seen them, there are things like prayer wheels, etc. There are machines that will do your prayers for you. So that is what he is saying. We might as well pray by machinery as praise by it. If we can bring in and let the instrument do our praising in music, then we ought to be able to bring in a prayer wheel and let it do the praying. And we get more and more into a spectator. Yeah. The thing I find them...
preaching by machinery?
We could. And I know places that do. But one of the things I find the most in preaching is the congregational involvement. And I always listen to comments on my preaching and everything, and one of the common themes I get in the feedback is that a lot of people don't understand why I do some of the things I do. The things I do are designed to increase the participation in the sermon of the congregation. Because for the average member, the sermon is when they get tuned out. It's no more acceptable to get tuned out in the sermon than it is in the singing or the praying. It's not. But, again, we have a leader in those areas, and we respond to the leader. So, if the congregation does not get involved in the sermon, then that is my fault as well as yours. Yeah. So that is why I developed my conversational style of preaching. That is why I use humor and tell stories. That is why I call names of those that have told me they don't care. I won't mention Eddie here, but see, now you care. See how that works? You say you don't. You say you do. We need, if we let the instrument do the singing just on that practical level, then the involvement in the singing falls off, you know. And if I get up there and preach, and I preach something you've heard 1,000 times, and I preach it in the same tone of voice all the way through, you probably got a nice nap. If not physically, at least mentally. Yeah. So that's what we're fighting in these things. Oh boy, we have 1 minute to finish this section. Let's go to David Benedict. David Benedict is one of those scholars. I wish I had his education. But he is most famous as a Baptist historian. So understand a couple things. This is a Baptist, but this is a Baptist historian, and one of the modern ones considered, you know, to be a great scholar of their history. So in his book, 50 Years Among the Baptists, he said this quote: "Staunch old Baptists in former times would have sooner tolerated the Pope of Rome in their pulpit as the organ in their galleries. And yet, the instrument has gradually found its way among them and their successors in church management." So all these denominations, again, that break off and form new groups and everything. And of course, today we have the so-called community churches that have in their church management experiences a variety of different things and become very syncretic as a result. So it's gradually found a way among them and their successors in church management with nothing like the jars and difficulties which had arose of old concerning the instruments. They tried to bring the instrument into the Baptist church in this country. I think it was the 1800s before they even tried, if I remember right. But they got, what in our parlance, they were body slammed on the issue, you know. And I will say this, and I'll follow up with something else and I'll close. The average member of a Baptist denomination in the 1800s knew his or her Bible very well. Don't ever think that they weren't diligent in their Bible study, you know, and in their attempts at interpreting God's will, because they knew it very well. That is why they were so famous. If you didn't understand his little jibe there, the old Baptists, the Baptists still tend to hate the Catholicism, which I understand, but the Pope has always been the focal point of their arrows and darts. So when he says they would have rather had the Pope in their pulpit than an organ in their gallery, you can't make a stronger statement of that. When they tried to reintroduce it, so they got body slammed the first time. So generations later, they try again. And it comes in, notice his wording, gradually. So why did he get body slammed in the early 1800s and then in the 1900s just slide right in?
Because we're more educated than them.
Yeah. Because the average member of the denomination did not know the Bible as well as they had 100 years previous.
And they had died off.
You think we can learn anything from that? Maybe. Maybe we can. All right. I appreciate your attention this morning. Lord willing, we'll take up there next week and